the good news is that I don't have to say too much because you can clearly tell from the presentations that we talk a lot. So there's quite a lot of repeated content, if you want to call it that. But in repeating content, it just emphasizes where we're headed and the importance of the discussions we're having. So typically what would happen is if I get invited to do something like this, I would go straight and dive into the detail and say, okay, if you want to do a door schedule, this is how you're going to do it. And it solves the problem and you go like that. So I've taken a bit of a different approach today and I've gone, okay, how do we get to that point where we can do a door schedule efficiently? So you can see there, and again, clearly we talk, if you look there, building information modeling is actually better information management, and that's a theme that the BIM community has kind of adopted and is using as a catchphrase through it. You've seen it in one or two of the presentations already. All right, so just to touch on it, you know, building information modeling has revolutionized everything we do in architecture, engineering, and construction. Emphasized, and again, I'm repeating stuff that has been said already, but we started from a drawing board. Drawing board moved into a CAD environment, and that revolutionized. That was the first kind of big disruption that happened. So you could reiterate and you could iterate stuff quite quickly. The problem is that when the minute you start sharing that information, you would open a CAD drawing and there's 15 plans across the model space. You don't know which one is right, and it's people just testing and driving and trying to change and see what's right and what's wrong, and that became frustrating in trying to manage it. So you can imagine if you've got 10, 12, 15 consultants, you don't know what's the latest info, where it's coming from, is it right or not, has it been issued correctly, all of that kind of thing. So what this means, and then from that environment, we went into 3D CAD, which was revolutionary at the time as well. Things like architecture desktop, which died a slow death because you could basically visualize your 2D stuff in 3D, but you couldn't do much more with it than that, right? So now where we are now in terms of building information modeling, better information management, it allows us to do much more efficient collaboration. There is a single source of truth. Everything is supposed to be housed in one place, and it is managed in a way that it is a completely collaborative environment, where before it was relying on info coming from a whole lot of different places. And then what has been said before as well is the management of this process is far more efficient. So you can have people who wouldn't normally be involved in the detail. They can't look at a drawing, they can't understand it. There's no more pulling the wool over people's eyes, whether it be a client, a project manager, a stakeholder that is yet to be defined. The information is out there for everybody to see, which is quite important. So there's kind of key stages in the BIM process and how we set these things up. So in the pre-design phase, we have a look and we look at the project, and this is where we as a company, I've been with Light for almost 18 years now. And again, we started in no man's land and we kind of used Revit to kind of go, yeah, we're doing it. And we threw the kitchen sink at the first few projects we did. We did everything. We modeled the purlin nuts on a roof truss to show, look at what we can do, you know. So what this pre-design phase tells us is we need to go back and say, what are the objectives? What are we trying to achieve by going through this process, okay? So we start off and we look at what is the BIM brief, and that comes from a number of different factors, and I'll get into that a bit later. And from the BIM brief is where we develop our BIM execution plan, which, as mentioned, is critical. I mean, Richard mentioned it. Without that in place, you will make mistakes down the line and you redo stuff. So trying to be efficient in what you're doing actually goes backwards and you become inefficient and you start losing money in the process. Okay. From that pre-design, we go into the design phase, logical obviously, but that process refines the model, and through collaboration, it's iterative, and you go into the clash detection phase. So you'll start off at concept design. That'll be a massing model, it'll be a test fit on a site, it'll take the town planning restrictions into account and say, can you do X, Y, Z with it? Will you achieve the bulk or not? Can you achieve your parking ratios? Very, very high level stuff. That then goes into schematic design, and the schematic design process says, okay, these are our routings, this is how we're going to approach things. We want to put our plant here, our equipment there, our ducts there, etc., etc. From that, you go into detailed design and you actually say, oh, I've got a duct, but it's a little bit small because the duct is a bit bigger than I needed, or whatever it is. And we eventually get to a point where we've got a proper detailed design pack, which can quite quickly be packaged for tender, comments back from a contractor, and you go into the construction phase. Okay. So within the construction phase, that allows, if the process is followed correctly, and this is what we're currently doing, is the contractor has full access to that model that is being built. What that means is not only do we move away from our paper environment that we've been pushing for a long time, and I'm quite proud to say I haven't issued a paper drawing in about 7 years, because I issue everything digitally, because there's other issues at play which we won't get into, but that's been a big driver of mine. Not necessarily for the rest of the practice, but that goes to what we were talking about. You've got to have a process, right? So he's got his typical 2D details, 2D drawings. They can follow that. But let's say there's a portion of the building that they don't understand. Through the use of various tools, which I'll talk about just now, is you can get into a process where the contractor can go and pull his own sections through this model and say, is that what that ceiling does? No problem, can get on. It kind of reduces the RFI process, reduces the mistakes on site. There's a whole benefit to where we're headed with that kind of phase of the process. Excuse me, sorry, my whole family's sick, so I've got a bit of a... Then we get into the operational phase. And this is becoming more and more important, and I think, Richard, you touched on it as well, in terms of creating that digital twin, and what information is required from a digital twin point of view to take us into operations, to make us more efficient in the life cycle of the building. And particularly over the last 3-4 years now, getting to 4 years probably, where people are no longer based in the office. So a building which was designed, finished in 2017, is working very differently to that same building operating now. You've got half your staff is at home 2, 3, 4 days a week. The office is empty. Your load on your AC is half of what it should be. Your lighting load is half of what it should be. So if we have the design parameters around the model, and we've got the BMS systems picking this up, we can then fine-tune the building to reduce the operational cost. And Richard, you mentioned it, is the operational life cycle is far, far, far bigger than the design cycle of the life cycle of a building. So it's critical. And all of these things plug into how we're managing this process. Okay. So in order to get to this point, there's a few fundamentals that have to be defined moving forward. So we've got to define the protocols that are put in place. We've got to define the processes that are put in place. And we have to define the technology that has to be put in place. Now, no apologies, this is the third time you're hearing it today, but it is true, and that's why we bang on about this. Because without this in place, as we mentioned, the cost of the software is immense in the scheme of things, but if you manage it efficiently, it becomes minimal. If you can have your people being efficient, the software costs disappear. Okay. So in terms of the protocols, when we're setting up a project from the beginning, we have to understand what project stages, what level of detail those models need to produce, and what are the documentation protocols. What is being issued? Is it a physical drawing? Is it a PDF? Is it a model? And that comes into play quite dramatically. What I'm calling intellectual property here is, what are our data exchange requirements? What is there a common data environment? I'll touch on that a little bit further down the line. But we need to understand where is that housed, because traditionally, as an architect and engineers in a similar kind of realm, you held ownership of those CAD drawings. They were yours. Nobody could access them. In this common data environment, that's no longer the case. Your model's out there. If you've got a proprietary family you've developed, everybody's going to be using it because it's there. So I've had to educate my partners to go, we don't do that anymore. We can't strip a model because it means nothing to anybody then. So our IP lies in the authoring of the design as opposed to the authoring of the model. And it's quite a big mindset shift that you've got to adopt. And then finally, communication. And this has been a big change. So you've got to understand what communication or what info is required and when it's required, what meeting requirements are in place. Traditionally, we had a project meeting once every 2 weeks, and we had a site meeting every other week, and that was that. Now we have to have BIM coordination meetings. We've got to have information meetings to make sure we've got the protocols in place. So it does take up more time, but that time manages the process so that the information flow is getting better. And then what are those exchange requirements and at what stages? So we would typically, the way we operate with most of our consultants is we have a weekly publish and share of the model. That gets pushed out, we get their models back, we consume it, we carry on, we do what we need to do. We hit a milestone, that gets packaged and parked, and then we start that process again in the next stage. So it's very clear where those gates are, and then you can go and compare what happened at what stage. Okay. When we get to the process, as I mentioned, the BIM brief becomes quite important. So it outlines what the project requirements are. What are we looking for? What are the fundamentals that we are trying to achieve by putting this model together? And as I mentioned, when we started this process, we threw the kitchen sink in it and it backfired so badly we don't even want to talk about it. It's kind of like a blacked out memory. So we understand what we're trying to achieve from the model. And if you're building an RDB house versus a 60-story building, the requirements are very different. So your BIM protocols are very different. And that leads us into the BIM execution plan. And that is our Bible, for want of a better word, on how we manage these projects. It outlines project coordinates. It outlines baselines. It outlines drawing numbering protocols. It outlines model naming protocols, who the contact people are, where information needs to be shared, how it outlines the whole way forward. So there's no guesswork involved, and it talks exactly what was said this morning, is if there's a process in place, it's easy to follow it, and it makes life a lot easier. Okay. Part of this process is identifying who the project stakeholders are, and they're broadly in 3 groups: the owner, developer, consultants, and end users. And those could be, the end users could be the final tenants, it could be the building owner, it could be the FM operator, it could be a number of different people. But that's the broad overview of who would be involved in this process. And each one of those 3 pillars needs something different from the information that's been shared. Okay. Then we go and we want to understand what are the uses of the model, as I mentioned just now. Okay. So are we using it just to put a quick presentation together, which is one set of goals? So if you want a quick thing, you want to put it out, give it to somebody in 3D Max and render it, that's one way you target it. If you are looking at construction documentation, you've got to think of it quite differently. And what is the change in level of information required between those two? And then finally, operationally, where during the process, we obviously get a lot of design and supply stuff coming in. We're starting to see contractors buying into the models. They start developing their own models, and they almost will build. We've had 2 cases where they've taken our model, they've built it themselves with the view of how they would build it on site. They learn their mistakes, get on site, and they minimize the abortive work on site, which is a fantastic place to be. And that's the end goal of what we're trying to achieve, When we talk about identifying the project team and their capabilities, so there's 3 kind of things we need to understand there. What is the team's proficiency? It was alluded to earlier that you've got a team which is involved of a number of people. Some have high skills, some have low skills, and there's a whole range of people in between that. But effectively, from a company standpoint, is there the proficiency to take on the specified role? So again, if I use the RDP house versus a 60-story building, the level of proficiency is in the BIM environment is very different. You might have somebody who's amazing at this, but they can't achieve that because they haven't built their skill set. Okay. That then goes into a willingness, and you can only really do that internally in your teams. It's quite difficult to do it externally because we know, and I'm sure you go through the same thing, I've got older staff who've come from a drawing board and have gone, you know what, I'm here, I need to adapt, and they've really taken the bull by the horns, and they have gone, this is what I'm doing. We've got the same peer group who've just said, that's not what I do, this is how I do it, and and where do they fit into our current environment, and where do they fit into our environment with our clients, which is an important distinction. And how do we change that culture within our companies? Then it's the structure of the company. So I was talking to somebody earlier, and basically we can split it into three kind of approaches, company approaches. The first one is where people go, okay, well, this is what I do, this is how I've done it for years, that's how I will always do it, and they will carry on, they'll get the relevant work that applies to them, but they're never going to break into a new market because that's not where the world sits anymore. The second tier is where you get a boss, CEO, leader saying, okay, we've identified that, yes, we do need to do something, but I'm going to farm this out, that person over there, just run with it and get it done for us because we've been told we need to do it, so just run with it. So there's no real driver from the top down going, okay, this is what we need to achieve. And the third approach is the approach that I've taken, I think you've taken the same approach, where it is a top-down, this is what we are doing, we are driving it, and there is no option. That is how we're managing our processes. And that's quite important. Okay. There we go. Then we talk about technology. We've spoken about it. It's come up a number of times on where tech comes. So I'm very much in Michiel's camp where I've gone, as much as I'm an architect, there's something else out there. How do we drive these processes? But it's not a suite that solves all our problems. And Richard, you alluded to exactly the same thing. You've got 400 packages or platforms that you can put on the table. What is suitable for the purpose of what you're trying to achieve? So for concept design, a little quick AutoCAD sketch might be fine. A SketchUp model or a format model. Revit in a massing environment. For big master plans, as an example, we're using InfraWorks quite a lot. Helps us mass out the road infrastructure quite quickly. You draw a road in Revit, it's not an easy thing to get it right. Did in InfraWorks, it is a breeze. We then take that InfraWorks stuff, we plug it into Revit, and we can then take it from there. And when we're talking about the AI kind of environment, Forma is a great tool because now you take a piece of land, you can math something out, and you can say, okay, I've got a building, the footprint has to be 16 meters by 20 meters, the efficiency ratio needs to be 85%. What does that mean from a bulk point of view? We throw it onto the side, do a few iterations, and go, okay, that's great, the project doesn't make sense, we don't take it any further, there's no time wasted. Whereas historically, we would have to develop something that would take us weeks and weeks and weeks, only to be told the project doesn't work, throw it away. So we've saved a huge amount of money using these kind of tools in the environment that we're playing in, right? Once we get to the delivery stage, it was, up until the last few years, there were silos. And I say that quite loosely, but if you were an ArchiCAD user or a Revit user or a whatever, it was all quite separate, and you could integrate, but it was a tough road. Today, those problems are largely resolved. And from that point, I can interact with somebody who's using ArchiCAD over there and Civil 3D there and Procon over there. We bring it into a single environment, and there's various ways of doing that. So we are using software like Revisto. We're using that quite heavily. Navisworks, been around forever. We use that quite heavily. But, and I'll talk about it in a minute, but where we've moved into is the ACC environment. Okay. Then from an operational point of view, the digital twin point of view, there's a plethora of software out there, but these are just some of the ones that we've experimented with. So Tandem, you literally just plug your Revit model in, and you can program it to do what you need to do and pull out the info that you need, link it to your BMS systems, and move forward. Okay. Matterport we've played with a bit. It's a scanning kind of, I'm sure you all know about the Matterport kind of suite and where it fits in. You can then tag your elements within that and manage it from there. And then similarly, Bentley iTwin it's a similar kind of process, right? So when you are choosing your technology suite, understand what you're trying to achieve. It goes back to one of my earlier points. What are you trying to achieve? And use the relevant software that will get you to that point. All right, now we talk about a passion point of mine that has come across over many years of dealing with this kind of thing. What is our exchange environment? You know, there's plenty of, email, everybody just emails a drawing. You know how emails get lost, it goes to junk, you miss it, whatever, information gets lost, it's a big problem. There are other platforms out there, there's AConnX, there's the Synergies, there's the, those kind of are geared for the construction industry. SharePoint we all know, maybe not necessarily love, but we know, we use it, we do what we do. There's FTP sites, there's all sorts of things. But where we have landed is on ACC, the Autodesk Construction Cloud. And we have said, okay, we've made the call because we are working in this environment and it's about a commitment thing. You're not half pregnant, you're either pregnant or you're not. So we've said, that's what we're going to do. And as a result, we turned off our servers about 15 months ago. We don't have any physical servers in our office at all anymore. So everything we do is cloud-based. There's a limited portion we keep on SharePoint for various reasons on the accounting side mainly, but everything we do is in ACC. And the benefits that come from that are, first one, let's just talk about information management and how we're dealing with a simple PDF. Historically, you would have a PDF, it would have a name, it would have a date, it would have a revision, it gets sent out, that gets filed, and you have the same drawing, you've got 47 versions of the same drawing, and you click the wrong one, and next thing you arrive on site, and it's built incorrectly, and now you throw a panic, and you kick walls over, and you do what you do. What happens on ACC is, when you overwrite the previous file, you don't have a revision, you don't have a date, you overwrite it, and in a Windows environment, you panic because now you've lost it. In ACC, what it does is it stacks it for you. So you can think of a stack of papers vertically stacked like this, and you've got every revision from the first one. So you've got revision 1, revision 27. You can now go back into that and say, let me overlay what I had on revision 1 and revision 27. We can see what the changes are. We can see what the cost impacts are. We've got the history of the project. If there's ever a query of why things changed, the history's there. It's an amazing tool. But not only does it work for PDFs, it works with our models as well. We overlay our models inside there, and you can go and compare what's happened, what's changed, where things have changed and moved, and why. We can, I'm under correction, and Michiel, you'll probably know better, but there's probably 50, 60, or 70 different file types that you can view within ACC. So we manage all of our Word documents, our Excel files, any SketchUp models we receive. You name it, we're managing it through there. And you can push and pull and take and do what you need to do with that information. Then it helps with the filing that Richard was talking about earlier. It's all in one place. There's the drawing number, there's the drawing register, easy to find, easy to track, and easy to move forward from there. So it's just a very quick overview. It doesn't go into any detail. Happy to answer any questions that anybody's got, and we can take it from there. Thank you.